Hi, I'm Joy Axelson, and we're going to be looking through the book of Ecclesiastes. But first I want to start off with the story of my daughter who one time, when she's 3 years old now, she was asking me about the wind. And I was thinking, how do you explain the wind to a small child? It's something you can't see. The only thing that you can see, and you don't know where it's going, but the only thing you can see is what it affects, like moving of the trees or how you feel it on your face. And she just could not understand about the trees. The wind, all she says is it blows. So the author of Ecclesiastes is sort of like that. It's like how different things in life cannot be understood and how these things are like the wind. Ecclesiastes focuses on man and his life on the earth, and God and his mysterious ways. Ecclesiastes goes beyond other wisdom literature to emphasize the fact that human life and goals as a means and an end in themselves and apart from God are worthless and meaningless. In the next 3 teachings, we're going to be doing a walk through the book of Ecclesiastes to give you a brief overview and summary of the whole book. Some people find this book very easy to understand, but for others it's more difficult and complicated for them. So this is why I want to go through the book briefly, just to give you a good overview to help you hopefully understand the main message of the book. And I also want you to be aware that I am using the ESV Bible. So let's start off and look at Ecclesiastes 1 through 11. And I want to start by reading verses 1 through 3. And it says, "The words of the preacher, the son of David, the king in Jerusalem. Vanity of vanities, says the preacher. Vanity of vanities. All is vanities. What does man gain by all the toil at which he toils under the sun?" So the preacher first introduces himself in verse 1. And actually in the Hebrew, the word which is translated in English as preacher or teacher is kohelem. And this is thus the name in the Hebrew Bible. This word does not exist in any other Hebrew writings, but its root word means to assemble. Therefore, the word could mean one who calls people to assembly, or someone who speaks in the assembly. The preacher is translated in the Septuagint as Ecclesia, the Greek word for assembly. So this name has thus carried forth into the English translation as Ecclesiastes. Ecclesiastes 1 verse 2 and 3, the author is introducing his main theme. In verse 2, the repeated word vanity means fruitless, futility, meaninglessness. Its root word means vanity or breath. Life is just like a gust of wind. So this is the key idea and the key word to understand the message of Ecclesiastes. And even the term vanities of vanities carry the idea of complete emptiness or emptiness of emptiness. So it's just nothing at all exists. And then we come to Ecclesiastes 1 verse 3, and it's a rhetorical question. And the main message is there is no profit for man in all his labor. Then we come to another important repeated phrase, under the sun. And this carries the idea that there is no purpose, no meaning, or even no afterlife in this temporary physical world. Therefore, the preacher concludes that all this toil, all this work is worthless. And he provides this pessimistic conclusion in the following verses to come and in the rest of the book, but he illustrates it from different angles and looking at different topics. Ecclesiastes chapter 1 verses 4 through 11 give examples from nature and human life that show an endless cycle, a meaningless repetition without purpose or goal. like the sun goes up and down, and the water comes and goes, but there is no purpose or end. It's just circular. So basically, no toil produces anything that will last any more than nature can. Everything is just repeated. Things seem to be new, start new, but in reality, it only seems new because the past is forgotten. And we see that in verse 10 and 11. And under the sun, in reality, nothing really lasts or satisfies. It just goes nowhere. And then on in the rest of chapter 1 and beginning of chapter 2 and Ecclesiastes 1 verse 12 through 2 verse 23, the preacher is searching for meaning and fulfillment in many things. You look, as you read through the text, he's looking through wisdom and folly, wealth, possessions, pleasure and work. But in the end, they are all meaningless because ultimately man dies and is forgotten. So this leaves frustration and a feeling of emptiness. All he has strived for ends up being useless. And another point is the wise and the fool both have the same fate, death. So in the end, everybody's just the same. Let's look at Ecclesiastes 1 verse 13, and it says, I have applied my heart to search and to seek and to search out by wisdom all that is done under heaven, or the same idea of under the earth, under the sun, It is an unpleasant business that God has given to the children of men to be busy with. So basically, even after this great search, the preacher, he wants to go and find the meaning of life under heaven or under the sun. And in some ways, he seems to imply that God is the cause of man's problems here. But remember, again, this is under the sun view of God. So this is the human view of God. God here is translated as the God in Hebrew. So it's the idea of just a general God. Ecclesiastes 1 verse 14 repeats the phrase, striving after the wind. It's the idea that it's impossible to control this, just like it's impossible to control or catch the wind. So it's just worthless or fruitless to even try. But let's look at Ecclesiastes 2 verse 24 through 26. And it reads, there is nothing better for a person than he should eat or drink and find enjoyment in his toil. This also I saw was from the hand of God. For who apart from him can eat, or who can have enjoyment? For the one who pleases him, God has given wisdom, knowledge, and joy. But to the sinner he has given the business of gathering and collecting, only to give it to the one who pleases God. This also is vanity and striving after the wind. So here we see that there is hope in the right view of God, or implied above the sun. God is the giver of wisdom, knowledge, joy, and enjoyment to men. It shows that there is more to life than hopelessness and death. To eat and drink indicates the importance of being content. And it's important to remember here in these verses that it's about God. It's the focus on God. And thus God blesses the righteous. The emphasis isn't on what the righteous do or gain, but it's that God blesses them. Sometimes I think that we forget that God does want us to enjoy life, that He has given us enjoyment even in the pleasant things and the small, simple things in life. And so take some time as you study through this book to meditate on this and to enjoy the simple things that God has given you. The end of Ecclesiastes 2 verse 26, where it repeats vanity, striving after wind, it perhaps refers to the plight of the sinner, which we see in the beginning of verse 26. Okay. Now going on to chapter 3, verses 1 through 9. In this part, time, the word time is repeated 29 times, and it contains a pair of opposites. For example, in verse 2, it says it's a time to be born and then a time to die. So it's usually the opposite of the other. So some people interpret these verses as the idea of fate, again, as we saw in chapter 1, just this circular, everything just happens circular, it just repeats itself, and so whatever will happen will happen. Chapter 3, verse 9 is a rhetorical question where it says, what gain has the worker from his toil? And basically that man doesn't gain anything from his work. No matter how advanced science or technology is even today, man still cannot control his happiness, he cannot control his fate. And sometimes man cannot even see the purpose of his work. And I mean, in reality, I think Ecclesiastes shows that man's purpose is and work is that he can see his need for God, that in everything else there is no purpose except in God. So let's read chapter 3, verses 10 through 15. And I see the business that God has given to the children of man to be busy with. He has made everything beautiful in its time. Also he has put eternity in man's heart, yet so that he cannot find out what God has done from the beginning to the end. I perceive that there is nothing better for them than to be joyful and to do good as long as they live. Also that everyone should eat and drink and take pleasure in all his toils. This is God's gift to man. I perceive that whatever God does endures forever. Nothing can be added to it, nor anything taken away from it. God has done it so that people fear before him. That which is already has been, and that which is to be already has been, and God seeks what has been driven away. So in chapter 3, verse 11, where it says eternity in man's heart, this can be somewhat difficult to translate, but it's kind of the idea that man wants to understand everything. Life, the future, God, but man is not fully capable of comprehending all of God or life. Man knows that there's more out there to understand, but he is just limited in his physical, finite way. In verses 12 through 13 here, we see that even though man cannot understand all about God or life, he can know God's love by faith, obedience, and enjoying the simple things given by God. Verse 14 emphasizes God's eternal sovereignty and how man's life is temporary. And yet this is to keep man in awe or reverence or fear of God. Going on in chapter 3, verses 16 through 22, the preacher observes that injustice is taking place, even where justice should have been found. So the only solution is death. This is a picture of life in a fallen world where there's unfairness and injustice. Thus humans are no better than animals. Everybody's equal in death, even to animals. So that the preacher does see that God will judge all in verse 21, but it seems like he's not really sure if there's an afterlife. He sees that God will judge in verse 17, but in verse 21 he says, who knows whether the spirit of man goes upwards or the spirit of the beast goes downwards in the earth. So basically nobody's been there, so nobody knows. So is there even really an afterlife? So he ends in verse 22, just says, just make the best of life now. Briefly, chapter 4, the preacher is looking at the oppressed and how much better death is than life. He also looks at the worthlessness of labor and riches, and how in the end they leave everyone feeling empty and unsatisfied. The preacher also looks at the fleeting nature of popularity and how it just also disappears. So we have seen in the first 4 chapters how the preacher has looked into all different kinds of things like pleasure and work. But he comes to the same conclusion, that everything is temporary and unsatisfying.